If you're a designer, you've probably heard of Adobe Max, or at the very least, Adobe itself. And regardless of what you think of the company, the convention always seemed pretty cool. Adobe Max is like this big conference, kind of like Comic-Con or something, but for design and creativity. They have people that speak and do workshops at it, everywhere from legendary designers like Aaron Draplin to YouTube filmmakers like Casey Neistat. Anyway, they approached me to design some YouTube thumbnail templates for all the live sessions from the actual conference. So in this video, I want to take you through my design process and how this whole project came about. So the past few years, Adobe Max has worked with this agency to come up with this co-create program. Basically, they hire designers and other creatives from a super specific niche to help them do like some of the creative work around the agency. Everything from templates to banner signs to social media stuff, illustrations, and so on. Since I'm a designer who also makes content on YouTube, they must have thought I was a good fit to make the thumbnails for the Adobe Max page this year. Being hired for something like this was very rewarding because a lot of times my client work and YouTube work don't mix together like this, but it was cool to be recognized as someone who's both a good designer and someone who knows a lot about this YouTube space. So the project first started by them sending me over some kind of PDF outlining the deliverables, and then we hopped on an initial call. I kind of proposed an idea that optimizes Adobe's thumbnails for YouTube, so larger heads, bigger type, things like that. That's different from what they've had in the past, because I think at the end of the day, it's important to get a high click-through rate on YouTube, and sometimes good design doesn't necessarily translate to good thumbnail design. That part's always harder to get over too as a graphic designer yourself. So on the call, I basically explained all the different tactics I would use to kind of make these more YouTubeified. The next step was the concepting and sketching phase, but first I had to grab some coffee. I'd also appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. So I worked on this project over the course of a few weeks and recorded most of the process along the way. So the deliverable was going to be 4 thumbnail templates. So I decided to design 3 versions for each of those to give them a little bit of a variety, but not stray too far away from the overall concept. The team sent me some events and examples that would need thumbnails, and that was good because it gave me the different versions I may need. One with a shorter speaker name and title, one that was medium length, a longer one, and then one that actually showed 2 different people. This was helpful for the different hierarchy and seeing what the maximum font size I could use to fit everything in the template. They also included these gradients that I needed to use, so I decided to just use those as the background, and I ended up pulling the images of some of these people online. This part was kind of hard because a lot of the images were super low quality, and I'm hoping the Adobe team will get some higher ones when they actually bust these out. As I was designing these, I was referencing some stuff I've seen work well on YouTube, as well as some of my own channel thumbnails that have worked well in the past, and kind of cross-referencing that with what Adobe's done in the past. Adobe has had an issue with their thumbnails in the past where I think they use them a little too templated, and some of the speakers or the topics get really small and they try to cram a lot of info into the thumbnail, and at smaller scales it can't even be read. So I kind of wanted to go to the opposite of that. At the end of the day, you have to give up some of your pride as kind of being this cool designer who works on nice contemporary things and design the best for the client. And in this case, the client is kind of the YouTube algorithm in a way. So I went with the big strokes on the type, big noticeable heads, bright saturated backgrounds, and bump the clarity on a bunch of stuff. I didn't want to just go into this style too without giving it any proper like explanation or the methodology behind it. So I put a little presentation together in InDesign to kind of back up some of my ideas. I basically broke down the 3 different versions I submitted. Version 1 included the shortened title, speaker name, session title, and the Adobe Max logo. I also explained how YouTube cuts stuff off, so we should front load the titles with the most important stuff, and the most important stuff in this case is usually the information or the topic rather than the speaker. The second version only just pretty much changed the position of the head, removed the session ID because it seemed irrelevant to have on a thumbnail, and then also keep the required Adobe Max logo. The third version was basically the same as version 2. I just moved the orientation of the speaker. In this presentation, I kind of also went into the details and some tips behind the thumbnail design. I was explaining how the photos should be cut out, they should be larger, saturated, clarity, brightness, all that boosted up. Titles should have good tracking in between them so they're readable at all sizes, largest strokes so they work on that gradient background, and pretty much just all the things you would expect to perform well on YouTube. I also kind of wrote a small caption reiterating this idea that good design doesn't necessarily translate to good thumbnail design. I knew I wanted to present some slightly different options, but not stray too far from the actual concept that I wanted to execute on. In the past, I noticed if you present an idea that you don't really like as much, the client's probably going to go with that one. You're going to be stuck working on something that you aren't really feeling. Once I sent the files to the agency team, they were pretty stoked on it and they liked the presentation I put together. And then they came back a few days later. I got an email from the agency. They led with saying things like they really liked the ideas, something this, blah, 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 but we need to make some changes, of course. So the team overall was really happy with the left side placement, the larger heads, and the hierarchy of the type. The Adobe team came back suggesting that we include everything, like the entire session title and session ID, and make sure the Adobe Max logo is placed in white on all of them this time. This was kind of a bummer because we'd be adding more information that would further complicate the thumbnail design, but I had to throw them a bone. They also suggested I created like a faded background for the images that are cut out to go over the gradients, and they thought that the heads kind of felt like a floating head. I didn't really know what that meant because that's kind of the meta, you could say, on YouTube, but I tried out what they said. They also asked if I could include some decorative elements, but I think that would go against the whole thing I've been preaching this whole time of wanting to make it simple and easy to understand so someone can just digest it and decide if they want to watch the video or not. So when I was working on these revisions, I was surprised that I actually kind of liked the look of the faded gradient background thing. I was right though to think that adding speaker titles made this more complicated and less legible at a smaller scale. I made the changes though and adapted each version and wanted to make sure I was giving them what they asked for, but my email also outlined some overall thoughts I had to help kind of stray us back into a better direction. I think as designers, we need to meet the needs of our clients, but we're also an expert on this subject, so when we think something should be done a specific way, I think it's important to convey our opinions. In the email, I basically outlined the changes I made and the decision to keep the title shorter. Even though they wanted me to keep it longer, I went with my gut because it was just going to be way too long on the thumbnail, really. I also outlined how I was not going to add decorative elements because that would go against my initial design thinking behind this project of making everything simple and easy to understand. Then I waited literally like a whole week, and that was a little bit stressful because I was worried that they weren't feeling like the decisions I made, but I wanted to be confident and I didn't email again like any insecurity or anything like that, and I just let it cool off for a bit. And it took about a week and I finally got some feedback and an email from the team. So once I got that final email, this is what it outlined for revisions. The Adobe team agreed we shouldn't include decorative elements and that the speaker title and name should be prioritized to increase simplicity. They also approved using the Adobe Max white logo throughout and also said it can be made smaller to actually increase the hierarchy of the main subject. It seems like we are finally getting on the same page fully and wanting to make everything more simple and have some nice breathing room. They said this originally when they told me about the faded gradient background, but I didn't really know what they meant. They want it placed in a 1x1 square, I guess so they can make it more templated and it's easier to plug in the different photos. This is where I did the final design changes, and I was a little bit worried about that square container. And once I started designing with it, I kind of agreed with my initial thought that it felt weird. I decided to approach this though similar to how I started the project and give them some options. Basically, I gave the client what they want, what I think they need, and some kind of mediation between the two. I created 3 different versions, one with a square and gradient background. This one works a bit better for spacing than the solid square, but seems like there may be some issues when adapting certain people's portraits. This next one was basically just the square. This works the best as a template since it's basically plug and play, just a square clipping mask. You can put any photo you want in there. But with that, you kind of give up some continuity with all the different speakers, photos, backgrounds, as well as the faces are overall a lot smaller and less noticeable. Lastly, we kept a similar one to the past rounds. Big head, cutout, gradient background, and I think this one performs the best on YouTube. We'll have the best click-through rate due to the size of the speakers and overall space to breathe and simplicity. The downside is that it's a little less templatey, so the Adobe team will have to do a little bit more customization with each one, but I think overall it'd be a net positive. From there, I sent over the final designs, all the changes that I made in the different versions, and reiterated some of my points and broke them down. So once I got a response, I ultimately went with my recommendation. We used the larger heads and decided to optimize for YouTube CTR, and we'll see how they look when they go live on YouTube. It's nice when your passion projects start to blend with your professional freelance career. If you enjoyed this video, hit that subscribe button. I'd really appreciate it. Trying to get to 20K by the end of the year. That's it for now. I'll see you next time.